What's up guys, my name is Ace, and yesterday Insider Gaming posted their interview with Charlie Olson, who is a former Call of Duty developer that wrote the MMR algorithm for Call of Duty Online back in 2015, and then it made its way into the mainline CODs with Infinite Warfare in 2016, and they've been using essentially that same algorithm since then. Now, just to be clear, we're not talking about the matchmaking algorithm here. This is the MMR rating, so your skill rating, and how it's calculated. This is the part he created, and apparently it's been largely unchanged since then. Now, obviously, the matchmaking algorithm, this has changed quite a bit. It has evolved and become more sophisticated over time, as it's described in the article, which of course I will leave linked down below, and I encourage you guys to check that out. But this whole interview is focused around skill-based matchmaking, and there are some really interesting points here that I wanted to go through today, and we're just gonna kind of walk through this point by point, and I'll share my thoughts as we go. And one of the first things that came up in the interview here is the white paper that Activision released sometime last year in Modern Warfare 3's life cycle, talking about how they handle skill. And Olson confirmed that the white paper is accurate, although I still push back against the whole ping is king statement. But I think that one comes more down to how you interpret the phrase ping is king. But we're not going to get too deep into that since he didn't really talk about the specifics of the white paper so much. However, the next key thing that he pointed out here is that live service games need SBMM and SBMM needs MMR. Obviously on that second part, without an MMR, you can't have an SBMM system. You need a way to determine the skill level of a player before you can match them based on their skill. And he said both are needed to ensure long-term sustainability and player engagement. But he said that doesn't mean everyone should just shut up and like SBMM. And so far, there's nothing here I really disagree about. I really strongly dislike the current implementation of matchmaking that Call of Duty uses. But in saying that, I do think some amount of skill-based matchmaking is necessary, especially if you want the player base to thrive and grow over time. You're going to have at least some protection for newer players that are just getting into the game, or the lowest of low skill players. There is going to have to be some separation so that they're not consistently playing against 20-year veterans of the franchise. And this has always been my stance. Some amount of SBMM is a good thing, and I would say arguably necessary. And I mean, Call of Duty has been using some amount of skill-based matchmaking for a very, very long time, long before this became the massive topic that it did with Modern Warfare 2019. But of course, I've made my stance very clear on this in recent years, since Modern Warfare 2019. The current implementation and how far they've taken the matchmaking, I am strongly against. I really don't like how much of an impact this is having on the game-to-game experience when playing Call of Duty. And that's why, of course, I've been very critical of this modern matchmaking system for quite a few years now. But back to the interview, Olson explained that about half of the players would be driven to stop playing without SBMM because the sometimes you stomp, sometimes you get stomped narrative only applies to around 40% of the players by skill, with 10% of the very top players doing 90% of the pub stomping. And this is one part of this interview I do want to push back on a little bit. Although again, I think he's speaking to the extremes here. Like if they were to literally eliminate SBMM, yeah, I don't think that would be the most healthy thing. And like I said, I do think some level of SBMM is a good thing, just not the current level of this. And he says that around half of the players would be driven away and would stop playing if there was no SBMM. But with the current implementation of the really strict SBMM, we're finally seeing a whole lot of burnout in the community from the more long-term, dedicated, addicted Call of Duty fans. I think many of those players, they hung in there for a few years. They were holding out some hope that something would change here, or they were just straight up addicted to the game. They couldn't drop the habit. And many of those players are now finally breaking free from Call of Duty, breaking away, and the franchise appears to be losing many of those loyal, dedicated players. And I'm seeing this more than ever, especially in my comment sections, for instance, just as an example here. In recent years on my videos, I'd see the odd comment pop up here or there saying like COD is dead and I'm so done with this franchise and stuff. But that was just the odd comment here or there, and the rest of the comments would generally be focused on the content of the video. This year, with Black Ops 6, it seems no matter what I upload, it can just be a regular gun guide episode or a breakdown of a perk, for instance. My comment sections are just flooded with so many people that are like, I'm done with Call of Duty. I'm so burnt out. I've been holding on for all these years. I finally broke free. And these comments are often outnumbering the comments that are actually relevant to the topic of the video that I've made. So the general sentiment in the core community, the community that's online talking about Call of Duty, really seems to have shifted strongly in the negative direction this year. And it has been a very obvious shift for those of us that are involved with the community on a regular basis. This doesn't appear to just be the annual Call of Duty lull. It really seems we're seeing an overall general shift. And therefore, I think we're really starting to see the long-term negative impact of the matchmaking system they've been using. In the short term, it's been working great. Long term, I think it's starting to fall apart. And I believe they're starting to lose their previously loyal, dedicated fan base. So while yes, eliminating SBMM entirely, I don't think would be a healthy thing at all, I also think there's a healthy balance to be found here, and they haven't really done anything to try to find that balance, it seems, with Call of Duty, which in the long run, I feel is going to have a far worse effect than potentially pushing away some of the newer or lower skilled players by having a less strict matchmaking system that doesn't cater to them so heavily at the expense of the above average players. Also, right after that in the interview, he did bring up XDefiant as an example of turn-based matchmaking, and I knew this was going to happen the moment XDefiant was announced to be shutting down. I knew people were going to start blaming this on the lack of skill-based matchmaking, and perhaps that was a part of the downfall of XDefiant, but I think there are many other key elements that led to the downfall of XDefiant that have nothing to do with their matchmaking system. In either case, moving on, when talking about solutions to the matchmaking, Olson mentions that he thinks the solution here is transparency of where players rank with their skill. He said the massive problem with SBMM, though, is that you don't know what league you're in anymore, and SBMM takes away the sense of skill and mastery. There's less skill feedback, stats don't matter as much, KD is less of a bragging right, and it's a serious design problem, really. He then went on to say, if you're trying to get better at the game, SBMM just rewards you with tougher opponents. And then he said, I'd even say that SBMM punishes players for being good, and players are right to complain about it. And this is where it's just so nice and validating to hear from somebody that's been on the inside, that was heavily involved with these systems, finally acknowledging the fact that this is actually a serious design problem, and we have a right to complain about this, and it's not the usual hand-waving of, hey, this is the system that's best for player retention, and therefore, too bad, suck it up, you have no right to complain. I think that's been one of the most frustrating things over the years that has really contributed to the long-term burnout as well, is it seems like they hear all the complaints and the outcry against this, and they basically just say, well, according to our data, this is best for the game, so too bad. Instead of, okay, there's clearly an issue here, we don't have this dialed in right where we need it to be, what kind of middle ground can we find here? What kind of solutions can we find to try to at least meet in the middle somewhere, or offer some solution to this problem that will make the people that are upset about this at least somewhat more happy than they currently are? Olson thinks one solution is to reward players with more XP for being better at the game. He said casual doesn't need to be completely about skill like ranked, but you should see something about the average skill of your lobby or opponents, like maybe this match is a gold tier match, so you get a 1.2 XP multiplier. He also says you should be able to see your MMR or your skill rating in the combat record, and you shouldn't have to file a personal data request with Activision just to get that information. So it seems like he's been keeping up with the news a little bit, and the fact that we can get our hidden skill rating, but you have to file a personal data request with Activision to do that, which I have already covered extensively on the channel. And when it comes to a solution about getting more XP depending on the skill level of the lobby, honestly, I don't know if that would really be enough or that would really appease people that much, since for many, XP really isn't even all that important to them. But I absolutely think showing the skill level of the lobby, even if it were a very generalized thing, like just showing that that was a gold lobby, for instance, or a platinum lobby, or whatever it might be, I would absolutely welcome a change like that, although I feel like that's something where they'd have to wait until the end of the match to show you that. If they showed you that right up front, that would just contribute to lobby shopping a whole lot more, and also it would make it a whole lot easier to exploit the system, because then for the people that are trying to exploit the system, they'd get that instant feedback, and they'd see before they even get into the match that, yes, it worked. I'm in the absolute lowest skill bracket for this lobby, so I'm going to be able to absolutely stomp on it. But even just showing that after the match has taken place would be really validating. That way you could look at your performance relative to the skill level of the lobby, not just in isolation, and then you're left guessing, well, that might have just been a bot lobby, and that's why my performance looks so good on the scoreboard. That would at least feel a little bit better, and then definitely, as I've been pushing for, your hidden skill rating shouldn't be hidden. If it's going to be determining your gameplay experience so heavily, it should be something that you can see and track in-game for yourself. I'm not necessarily saying that we should have access to see everybody else's skill rating, but even just our own skill rating would be very useful. And that's something XDefiant had, and I actually really enjoyed that part about XDefiant. It gave you something to work toward and grind toward and track that improvement more accurately over time than you can by just looking at your kill-death ratio, for instance. Now, I know what many of you are thinking, and I'm thinking this myself. Whenever something like this comes up, the question always arises, isn't that what ranked play is for, if you want to track your improvement over time and see where you stand relative to the lobby and all of that stuff? And I totally agree and totally understand where you're coming from. To me, it makes total sense to have your casual public matches, which is more or less SBMM free, or at least has very limited SBMM to the point where it's not drastically impacting your gameplay experience on a game-to-game basis. And then you have ranked play if you really want to take it super seriously and grind your skill level to see what rank you can achieve and to see what your skill potential is. I think in an ideal world, yes, that's the system that we would have. But I think it's obvious after all of these years that that's not what's going to happen. And unfortunately, I think the best we can ask for here is at least some concessions like this. If they're going to keep that matchmaking system around, at the very least, they should be more transparent about that matchmaking system. So I absolutely agree with Olson here. I think one of the trade-offs that could be made here, one of the concessions, since obviously they're not getting rid of their matchmaking system, one of the things they could do to help appease higher skill players is at least show where they stand. Let us track our skill rating. Let us see what the skill level of that lobby was after a game ends. Now, he went on to explain that he did pitch a system like this for Call of Duty on multiple occasions, apparently even with a meeting at Infinity Ward when they were developing Modern Warfare 2019, which is where things really changed. However, he did mention that there's a lack of bandwidth within the studios to consider new ideas outside of the lead studio, and therefore the idea just never caught on. He also said the other reason he thinks it didn't catch on is that most designers just don't know much about how MMR works, and therefore they aren't comfortable using it as a component for design. And that's an interesting little tidbit as well. Now, moving on to the next section here, he talked a little bit more about how MMR, or your skill rating, works, and he confirmed what I suspected based on the data that we've seen with our data requests, and that is your MMR, or skill rating, is going to be more volatile in the mid-range, which is another issue that could be addressed. He said that CoD players that have requested their data will likely be seeing that volatility, with their skill rating bouncing around without a clear indicator as to why it's bouncing around so much. And he just goes on to say that's why we should be able to see and have some more transparency surrounding the system. He also points out that this lack of transparency is what's leading to a lot of conspiracy theories flooding the internet. And unfortunately, he didn't specify which conspiracies he's talking about here, but I suspect it's things like skill-based damage, for instance. Now, moving on to the next section here, he says, contrary to what many players believe, you really don't have to try your hardest every match. If you go off meta, your MMR will adapt after a few bad games and matches will get easier. And while we've known this to be true, if you play really bad for a handful of matches, your lobbies are going to get significantly easier, at least for a couple matches, until you perform too well and then you get kicked back up again to the higher skill lobbies. I still don't think this is a good thing. I don't think that if I want to grind some really weird gun for camos, that I'm going to get absolutely stomped on, including my team, because the team balancing algorithm is expecting me to carry the team, but obviously I'm going off meta, so I can't do that, so the whole team just gets stomped. I have to spend 20 to 30 minutes getting stomped on like that before the algorithm adjusts, so then I can now get the games where I can reasonably grind that really bad weapon. And then once I'm done that, I'm getting kicked right back up into those hard lobbies again. Now, I'm not saying I should just be able to dominate with any gun at any given time, but a little more consistency I think would go a long way there. Instead of knowing that I just have to suck it up and take my beatings for a few games before the algorithm decides to put me into the version of the game where it's reasonable to get headshots with that bad gun, for instance. So I'm not really a fan of that statement of you don't really have to try your hardest every match, because it's basically just implying that you don't have to try your hardest every match because you can effectively just soft reverse boost yourself to get to a version of the game where then you can perform well without trying your absolute hardest, at least for a couple matches before you're kicked right back up again. In either case, he also pointed out that CoD's SBMM does get mistaken for engagement optimized matchmaking system, but it's really just because the MMR is highly responsive and volatile. And admittedly, early on, when the term EOMM started blowing up in the CoD community, I bought into that. And I'm not talking about things like real-time nerfing of players in matches. I more so bought into the fact that it felt like the system was determining my highs and lows throughout a gaming session to try to target the perfect level of engagement. So it would purposely give me some hard matches and make me lose for a few games, but then it would adjust and give me a few wins, and that's designed to keep you hooked, kind of like a slot machine does, where it's trying to optimize and make sure that it's extracting as much money as possible from you while ensuring that it gives you just enough to keep you sticking around. But especially after breaking down the system more and now having access to the hidden skill rating via the data requests, I do believe that he's right here, and it's more so that this system is just so volatile that that's naturally how it works. You have a few really good games, your skill rating bumps up, now you're playing in much harder lobbies, you get beat up for a few games by those higher skill players, which pushes your skill rating down, which allows you to perform better again, and it's just that roller coaster cycle of volatility. And that's another big issue I have with the volatility of this system, is there's no consistency long term, especially when you combine it with the fact that we have forced disbanding lobbies. So when we find a good lobby where everything feels great, we can't just stick with that long term over an entire gaming session. Now, one thing I will note about this statement about engagement optimized matchmaking is Olson is no longer with Call of Duty. He hasn't been a part of the franchise since 2020, and therefore that doesn't completely completely rule out the possibility that engagement optimized matchmaking has actually worked its way into the game since he left. Again, the data that I've collected and analyzed suggests that it's actually not there and it is just volatile, but I also don't think it's fair to 100% rule that out at this stage. And with that, that pretty much wraps it up for the main meat of the article and the interview with Olson. Of course, like I said, I will leave that link down below if you guys want to check out all of the details of that. I covered all of the highlights at least. Overall, I did find this to be very interesting, hearing a little bit more from an individual that was involved specifically with the MMR system on the inside, and it's not just the usual PR response. I think one of the big takeaways here that I was happy to see is it's clear that there are people on the inside that recognize that this is a clear issue and we do have a right to complain. While this current style of matchmaking system isn't going anywhere anytime soon, it doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that there isn't any room to appease the players that are unhappy with this. And I do think, just like Olson was pointing out in this interview, one of the easiest ways they can do this without changing the matchmaking system itself is simply provide more transparency. As much as I would prefer them dialing things way back to how they were back in the day, dialing back that SBMM system significantly, bringing in persistent lobbies, and then having ranked play as the place where you go if you really want to push your skill set, at this point, I also understand that that's not likely to be changing anytime soon. So at the very least, having transparency within the system would help. And of course, these are just my thoughts, and I'd love to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How did you guys feel about this interview and the things that were brought up here? Do you think more transparency with the system, showing you your MMR rating, and maybe even after a game showing you what the skill level of the lobby was that you were just in, do you think that would be enough to appease you and keep you happy with the system, even if you currently dislike how they're handling matchmaking? Or not? Do you think that wouldn't even be enough for you? Just let me know that, as well as any other thoughts you may have had in those comments down below. If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.